Before we can talk about the appropriate clothes to wear for a given environment, we need to talk about heat loss and heat transfer. We cannot create cold. Cold is the absence of heat. We can create heat and we can remove heat. Now in some environments we're trying to get rid of the heat from our bodies. And in other environments we're trying to trap the heat and not lose it. So it's imperative to understand the three heat loss mechanisms. The first one I would talk about is radiation. In radiation you can think of the sun beating down on you or the warmth of a fire, and you can think about forward-looking infrared devices, right? Heat radiating out. The next one is conduction. Think about lying on the ground and heat being pulled out of your body, because the earth is, at the end of the day, generally speaking, a huge heat sink. Conduction would also be an example of you put the spoon into the hot soup and it draws the heat out. Right? And then the last one is convection. So if you're blowing on the hot soup, you're using convection to pull the heat away. You can think about wind chills, right? That's a prime example of convection. Right? So we need to be aware of all of these and to utilize them or to prevent them from stealing our heat as appropriate. We'll start with a hot, dry environment, such as the American Southwest. And counterintuitively, the best answer is not t-shirts and shorts, because the sun is very much a threat. We want to minimize our skin exposure, not only to protect ourselves from sunburn and potentially skin cancer in our later years, but also to minimize dehydration. So loose-fitting cotton shirt and pants are ideal. You may have heard cotton is run. This is one of the environments where that's really an exception. We're not overly concerned with getting wet and chills from that. Rather, something that breathes and allows the perspiration to migrate out and then evaporate, which cools the body, is the way forward. A broad-brimmed hat is a very good idea to keep the sun off our face and the back of our neck. All right. Don't forget a pair of shades to protect your eyes. In an emergency, you could take a piece of paper or cardboard and cut 2 slits and then wear that to minimize the amount of sun your eyes get. Another thing we might consider is the shamag. All right. We can use this to protect our face breathing in during a dust storm. Not so much an issue in the American Southwest, but in some other deserts, a very real issue. To protect ourselves from the sun. Okay. And we can also use it to keep warm at night. And that's the other issue. Temperatures drop precipitously in deserts. There isn't the moisture to moderate the temperature. So we're definitely going to want to have a sweater or other warm garments for the evening. Summertime, it gets down to pleasantly cool, typically, but can actually be chilly. And then in winter months, it can get quite cold at nighttime. Indeed, even in the day, I myself participated in a snowball fight in Arizona. The next area I want to talk about is hot, wet environments. We can think about jungles, swampy environments, the tropics. This might include some islands, that sort of thing. In a dry environment, the sweat is typically evaporating, it's keeping us cool, and then we worry about chilly evenings. And as long as we stay hydrated, it's relatively easy for our body to cool off. In a tropical environment, we're not going to have as much evaporation. In fact, we may not have any because the moisture in the air may be so dense that there simply is no evaporation to speak of. So we're moving to something where short sleeves make sense because we're not as concerned about the sun drying us out as we would be in a hot, dry environment. And shorts could even be a good idea. I would consider insect activity and plants that may annoy, so we may actually want long pants. A lot of it situation dictates. And that brings me to this idea that we would have a second set of clothes. So during the day, we're sweating, it's hot out, we get rained on, whatever else. And in jungle, activity stops at night, as a rule. it's difficult to navigate and function in a dark, temperate forest, but in a jungle environment, forget about it. It's just stop everything, get your head down, come back tomorrow. And so we have two issues. One, if we keep one set of clothes dry, we can change into that at night. Dry is a relative term, and be much more comfortable. And two, a major consideration is mosquitoes. Malaria remains one of the deadliest diseases on the planet. The United States itself no longer has a malaria problem as we once did, but there are many parts of the world, particularly Africa, Southeast Asia, where malaria kills, and it's arguably the most deadly disease that humanity has even now. So long sleeves actually make a lot of sense because they help protect us from mosquitoes. And this is one of those environments where zip-off shorts actually makes sense to my mind, that you could unzip the pants when it's particularly hot out, and then in the evening as things cool down a little bit, and more critically, mosquitoes become active, cover up as much of your skin as possible. I'm going to talk now about cold, dry environments, and then I'll talk about cold, wet. Cold, dry is below freezing. We're still concerned about moisture, typically because of snow on the ground. So if we sit down in the snow or lie down in the snow and get wet, that's going to introduce some problems. Likewise, as snow gets down our neck, that can be problematic. But it's not as challenging in many respects as cold, wet is. And we'll talk about that when we get there. But we're going to start with layering and a base layer. Two major options. One would be polypropylene, and the other one would be merino wool. Believe it or not, in the 70s and earlier, you could get cotton long underwear, which kind of defeats the purpose, I think. Yeah, it does. There are silks. There's actually Nomex and other fire-resistant long underwear out there. Certainly an option. But generally speaking, the two big players on the block are polypropylene and merino wool. Polypropylene is typically lighter. You can get very thick polypropylene at that, and it's less expensive. It's a potential melt hazard, so please don't walk through burning buildings with it on. Not sure why you would, but there it is. I personally find it irritating a bit. That's just me. So I prefer merino wool, this is an example of. It's more expensive, but it breathes better. So if you start to overheat, it's more forgiving, and I prefer it, right? But it is more expensive, and so families with kids growing up may be hard pressed to spend money on this option when polypropylene works extremely well and is generally less expensive. On the other hand, I have grown in height in, I would not say, but well over 30 years. As we talk about these different layers, I'd like to share an acronym with you, and it's COLD, or colder. And the C is clean, both keeping our bodies clean so they run efficiently, but also our clothes, because dirt and oils and other junk actually compromise insulating principles. We want to avoid overheating, because if we start sweating and getting the clothes next to our skin wet, that's going to cause us real discomfort and put us at risk. We want to use layers. So this is our mid layer or mid layers, as I'll relate. And then we want to keep everything dry as possible, right? And then if we add the ER, that's for examine and repair. Have I lost a button? Is there a tear on a seam or some other issue? And then take care of it promptly, right? Okay, so my recommendation for mid layer is a heavy sweater or perhaps a fleece. And you might actually have, again, some multiples. So you might have like a flannel shirt, a heavy sweater, maybe a second sweater, depending. All right. And then for pants, this is where it gets interesting / tricky. There are some very advanced technical pants because we want to stay away from cotton. But unfortunately, many are serious money. But there's an opportunity out there and it might work for you. when I was in college, I came across in an Army surplus sporting goods store a pair of German Army wool pants. $20, done. And they were great. Still are. I could go camping in the winter, super cold, whatever, and these things held up, and they were warm, and they were comfortable, and they really were brilliant. And then one day, looking through a catalog, Swedish Army pants, $5. I don't really need them, but done. Right? So this is what I'm thinking. All right, kids are growing, and it can be really hard to justify spending good money on good equipment that a year or two later will be outgrown. With a bit of perseverance, maybe some luck, keeping a sharp lookout, Army surplus stores, various catalogs, online vendors, other sources, you may come across a used but not abused pair of Army wool pants. The U.S. Army used to wear them, the German Army used to, the Swedish, the Finnish, many other armies did, because it was a very good answer. And they will be very inexpensive. And the next sort of advantage that kids have on this quest, if you will, is that a lot of times when it comes to Army surplus or cast-offs or such, the smaller sizes are more prevalent. So the small, the extra small, which for adults may be a bit optimistic, but for kids may be a perfect fit. And so I would totally look out for those as a really good opportunity. If you can't, I get it, but we want to stay away from cotton, because even in a cold, dry environment where moisture is not the same kind of a threat as a cold, wet, there is moisture out there. And in the meantime, try not to sit in the snow, try not to kneel in the snow, squat down instead, right, to keep those pants as dry as possible. I'll say this for cold, wet environments. They're wonderful to operate in as long as it doesn't rain. And that's the key idea there. Wool, when wet, will have about 50% of its insulative value, and cotton about 1%, which is pretty useless. Down, forget about it, it's out the window. There are a number of synthetic type products that do reasonably well when wet, and some that are hydrophobic, that is, they tend to repel water and continue to insulate. So you're out on a fall day, the weather's nice, no worries until it changes to a downpour, and then you got problems, or if you fall into a river. And let's remember the wise words of Mark Twain. So, depending on, is it 50 or is it in the high 30s, we may very well have a base layer, as we did with the cold, dry environment. And I've been throwing a lot of shade on cotton, but let me talk about some cotton opportunities, if you will. All right. This shirt is Ventile. The theory of Ventile is that when wet, the ultrafine cotton fibers swell and they block, acting much like a wetsuit. The truth is, it's a durable water repellent finish that's applied to very fine cotton. And by itself, it actually gets wet and you will feel the wetness. But if you layer it with something below it, like a merino wool garment, it actually is an extremely effective solution. Right? Another thing that can work out well is waxed cotton, like these pants. Now, some waxed cotton garments are more water repellent and some are full-on waterproof. The downside, like Ventile, waxed cotton tends to be much more expensive than many of the other solutions, and it tends to be heavier. Okay, but it's a very durable one. It's very effective. So I'm rather partial to it. But again, choosing our pants, jeans are definitely out. If you have to wear something that's all cotton, a looser fitting garment is a better option, because at least then it won't cling to you so much if it gets wet. Look for polyester or polycotton or nylon or nylon cotton blends. These can answer quite well. And consider having rain pants on hand. I would certainly recommend that. Not so much out camping, but in an urban, suburban environment and going on travels, I consider the wool cardigan one of the most wonderful universal garments of all time because we can open up the vent and we can close it up if we're chilly. And if there's a light rain, heavy rain, it doesn't work out as well. But with a light rain, the wool is enough to repel it. So that one garment that solves so many problems. Hooray. Well, out in the field, this is my personal favorite. Right? This is the Arcus SWAT shirt. And this is the old version where it still has the chest pockets. Guys who are running and gunning and keeping the world safe for democracy nowadays are wearing plate carriers. So putting chest pockets on military garments doesn't make sense anymore. But it used to, way back in the Cold War days. So one of the things I love about this is I typically wear glasses and I can actually put them in one of the chest pockets at night if I'm sleeping rough, and it'll be right there in the morning, no problem. So I like that about it. But one nice thing about this particular fleece garment is it has this Pertex shell, which offers a lot of wind resistance and some rain resistance. And the insulating material continues to insulate when wet, albeit, once again, never as well, but still quite respectable. So think about some sort of mid-layer and use of wool, and then some other fleeces will provide some water protection. But really key is that shell, waterproof shell. This one happens to be Gore-Tex, and I can remember in the 80s when, as Andy McNabb puts it, God gave infantrymen Gore-Tex. Before that, yes, there's wax cotton, but it's kind of heavy, and as we related earlier, most waterproof garments didn't breathe. They didn't. None of them really did, even wax cotton. And so as a consequence, if you put them on, you would sweat, you would have all this moisture inside, and it almost defeats the purpose, blah, blah, blah. Also, they were noisy, et cetera, et cetera. And then along comes Gore-Tex, and it breathes, sort of. Your body heat will tend to drive moisture, sweat, anywhere it gets in, out. But if the surrounding environment is overly hydrated, the air has too much water in suspension, there's nowhere for this water to go, as it were. So it's not a miracle cure, but it can be a very good answer. Gore-Tex is pricey, all right, I grant you. But the saving grace for a family could be that the story of my own family, we were in a situation, a family trip that we required Gore-Tex parkas, and throughout high school and throughout college in upstate New York, no less, and for a number of years afterwards, that same Gore-Tex parka was my go-to solution for rainy days, for cold days with layering beneath, et cetera, et cetera. It's a really good investment, I think. So well worth considering. But it's not the only game in town. Right? Now, something that I have, this is a winter coat, but it's a true soft shell with a dense pile, right, with pokey, pokey, pokey. Not pokey, pokey hurts, but this is the concept behind it. And this one's from Buffalo, and they're the real pioneers of this type of product. And they have a thing called a Buffalo shirt, and I haven't tried it yet. And I'd like to, but it also flies in the face of all this talk about layering. Because the idea behind these garments is ideally, in a cold, wet environment, you wear them directly against your skin. And the idea is like, yes, this thing will get wet, and this shell, while water repellent, is not waterproof. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be breathable, so that moisture will escape from the body. And so we're out, it gets wet, it continues to insulate, and then the pile being up against your skin, instead of you having this like, this wet, clingy awfulness that's chilling me, you just have these little points on you that are wet, and the rest isn't in contact, and blah, blah, blah. And then the Buffalo shirt uses vent zips underneath the arms and elsewhere to let you moderate your heat depending on your activity. And that strikes me as a potentially promising solution. This garment also has vents on the sides. And for years, I never used it, but of late, I found myself using it in some cases where we'll get a little warm here, and I'm going to open these up as well as the vent here. So there are a lot of different garments that can solve this ever-present challenging problem, and I hope all this has been useful. Next, it's time to talk about socks. For the record, I do not have a sock problem. I have a sock storage problem, as in I'd like to have even more socks, and if I had a way to sort them properly, I would get them. Socks matter. They matter a lot. Almost everything else compared to socks, to my mind, is negotiable. So let's talk about socks. Yes, footwear matters, but that'll be for another time. I really want to focus now on socks. And back in the 70s and early 80s, when we just didn't know better, the theory was you would wear a pair of white con socks and then a pair of wool socks over them underneath your hiking boots. And the theory was that the cotton will pull the moisture away and from your feet, and the wool will keep them warm. Yeah, cotton really just gets wet, damp, chilly, and robs your feet of warmth. I have some cotton socks, not so much to wear, but for historic purposes. Right? Even when it comes to dress occasions where I'm not really worried about wilderness survival issues or hypothermia or frostbite or any of that, trench foot. No, I'm still going to insist upon a really good wool sock. It's a comfort thing. So let's talk about some sock options and begin with, yes, in the wintertime, really heavyweight wool socks are a good idea. So when you're buying your shoes, your boots, your sneakers, something to think about is in the summertime your feet tend to swell, and in the winter you're going to want extra room for extra thick socks and still be able to wiggle your toes to encourage circulation. So it's a really good idea if you're buying footwear in the summer or the spring to size up a little bit, if you take my meaning. Okay, and have plenty of room. Darn Tough is one of my absolute favorite brands, and it speaks to a philosophy I have. When you're looking for socks, think about an environment that, as the bard puts it, is their climate not foggy, raw, and damp, and has their tradition of sheep raising. So Darn Tough is located up in Vermont, which is a fairly mountainous state with a tradition of sheep raising, as well as some manufacturing, and it gets chilly up there, to say the least. All right, and in the UK, our green and pleasant land gets damp and chilly and wet, and also has a very strong tradition of sheep raising, or as we say, white gold. So I look to socks that are manufactured in places like Vermont and Scotland and Wales, because I can anticipate that the people who make these socks are operating in an environment day to day that is rigorous and demanding. Now this is a 1,000-mile sock. It's a particular brand that said, hey, you want to prevent blisters and chafing, one option might be a sock within a sock. So it's designed as this two-layer system to minimize the amount of rubbing against your feet. And they hold up rather well. So that's a good option. And then looking at some of the other sort of field-grade socks, the Army actually had these cotton ones, and I've kept them. Summertime, drier environments, they do answer reasonably well. I don't use them in the winter, that's for sure, or in the fall. These guys are also from the United Kingdom, nice, thick, heavyweight. I have some others that are not quite as heavyweight, such as this pair. More suitable for the fall and early spring, perhaps, depending. All right. But having a good range of socks, and I would encourage you, as you think about survival kits, if you have a day sack that you're using or such, put an extra pair of socks in a Ziploc bag. When I had the Meowed Apocalypse, I routinely carried a survival kit in it, and it included a pair of very heavyweight wool socks. The theory being, if I ever get in a jam with that car, I'm going to want to keep my feet warm, and that would be the way to do it. So socks, definitely wool or a wool blend. Avoid cotton, please, and have plenty of extra dry ones, because if your feet are warm, the rest of you is probably going to be all right. But if your feet get cold, it will pull the heat out of your body and it will make life miserable. And so I do think of socks as a priority. There's a wonderful old adage. There's no bad weather, just bad clothing. I think that's mostly true. Because I've been in some really atrocious weather that was pretty awful and miserable. But I was able to cope and indeed in many cases be okay with it because I had the right gear. And that's one of the things to think about, what really will work for you. And I can speak to my own experiences and what's worked for me and what perhaps is not. And misery is a good instructor, a cruel instructor, but very informative. Another thing we've spoken to is the financial issue. I recognize that for some families, much of this, or even all of it, may be out of reach. And I would point out there are ways, as I've also spoken to multi-purpose something. The shell that works as winter coat and rain jacket and other things. Army surplus can be a very good source. Military gear tends to be very rugged, which is a positive. It has to work, which is a positive. The price you typically pay for it is it's heavier. There you go. Good design actually is about compromise. Okay. One thing else I'd like to share is I've been doing a lot of reading of old Boy Scout handbooks and merit badge pamphlets and the like. This one, I believe, was my father's handbook from when he was in Scouts. And this one was actually my brother's. I had the previous edition, and I'm not sure what happened to it. But it's comparable in the technology and the mindset existed when I was in Scouts. And it's interesting to me to watch the changes. We live in a very exciting time, if you will, because there's been a resurgence of wax cotton and Ventile and some of the older technologies, as well as newer technologies like Gore-Tex. Now, for many of the viewers here, you might say, that stuff predates me. It might even predate your parents, depending on their age. But I can tell you, I remember when it came in, and it was transformative. And very exciting. And there continues to be refinements and advances in that product and others as well. So we can camp much more comfortably than our forebears. But again, a lot of it is it's mindset, right? And it's warm, dry feet. I think if you have a positive mindset and your feet are all right, you'll do okay. And you'll be able to enjoy the wilderness and the outdoor rigorous life. And if things go completely south, you'll survive, perhaps even thrive. Well, I hope this presentation has been helpful to you and enjoyable. Take care.